Welcome to PhD with Woman on It Hack the Future. My name is Beata Young, and today's PhD Positivity Hack delivered will be by our guest Emily Cherkin. Topic: Raising Digital Citizens: Why Tech Intentional Parenting Matters. Episode 139 starts here. Let me remind you, this is a grassroots community that focuses on women on IT, an inclusive forum of women in technology, startups, and female leaders who are supported by men as well. And I bring heart to that hustle because empathy is my motto. And empathy is critical when you're raising digital citizens. First, let me mention what's been happening in the world of our community. Congratulations and good luck to our former PhD guest, Kylie Stone, as she runs to present the A game at this year's Southwest Sydney. You definitely have our vote, Kylie. Congratulations to Abela Batanyuga, founder and executive director of Tanzania Bora Initiative, for winning the 2024 Women and Technology Recognition Awards last March. Mark your calendars. Precious Williams, founder of Perfect Pitch Group and former PhD guest, will be speaking at the Small Business Pro Power Conference in New Jersey in July, sharing inspiring insights on networking. Now let's go back to our topic, raising digital citizens, why tech intentional parenting matters. In today's digital age, our kids are growing up wired or wireless, but definitely less offline. But with so much to explore online, it can be a challenge to guide them towards responsible and safe technology use. Is there a way to raise tech savvy kids who thrive in our digital world? Join us with this conversation with Emily Cherkin, a former middle school English teacher, parent of two, and a consultant on raising healthy digital citizens. Emily, author of the best-selling book The Screentime Solution, a judgment-free guide to become a tech-intentional family, will share her tech-intentional approach, helping you guide your kids towards responsible and balanced technology use. Don't miss this opportunity to ask your questions, get your answers, and get your kid tech savvy ready. Emily, where in the world are you today?
I am calling from Seattle, Washington in the US.
Fabulous location, and any location is good to raise your tech savvy kid. Many parents, though, struggle with finding a healthy balance for their children's screen time. Can you elaborate on what tech intentional means and how it differs from a strict anti tech approach?
Yes, that's exactly it. I often talk about how I'm not anti-tech, I'm tech intentional. And to me, tech intentional means using screens in alignment with what we value, and resisting, limiting, and delaying any tech use that interferes with healthy cognitive, emotional, mental, and physical development. And a simpler way to remember it is later is better, less is more, relationships first.
Relationship first, what does it mean in terms of raising your kids when you're talking about relationship first? But it means it could be, sitting on Facebook.
Right. That's a good point. So we should say in real life relationships first. And part of it is, again, I think there are ways that we can use technology to connect with people like this. I think there's ways that we can stay in touch with family and friends using technology. That's amazing. What I worry about is when the technology becomes the solution for everything when it doesn't need to be. And often what I hear from parents is, that tech will solve a lot of problems for them as a parent, but it displaces the relationship piece of it. So a lot of parents want to know what's the best parental controls that I should put on my children's devices. And if that's the only question that they're asking, I would like to ask, well, what about the relationship part too? Because just putting the controls on doesn't solve the problem. We have to teach, we have to mentor. We can't just monitor their devices.
We can't just monitor their devices. However, your first habit focuses on accepting good enough as a parenting approach. How can
Yes.
parents overcome perfectionism and embrace this concept when it comes to managing screen time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I joke that I'm a recovering perfectionist because it seems like if we just do it all perfectly, there'll never be problems. But anyone who's tried that knows that's not true. The other thing about not being, we don't know all of the answers as parents. I think it's okay that there's lots of different parenting approaches and styles and values. What matters is that we are in communication with our children about why we have the rules we have or the values we hold. And when we make mistakes, that we own it and we talk about it and we say, oh my gosh, I messed up. I didn't know that, or I didn't know what to do. I feel like it's really a hard part of parenting is to not know the answer to everything. And so I really encourage parents to take those opportunities to say, I screwed up. I didn't know. Because that's great modeling as a parent too. It's a great opportunity for your kids to see, hey, we're not perfect either, and making mistakes is part of life. In fact, it's a healthy part of life. And so, and when it comes to technology, I think we have all kinds of opportunities to talk about mistakes.
Hmm. Mistakes so difficult to admit to them because it shows vulnerability, whereas our children want to have strong parents who are a perfect model. How can we keep the healthy balance?
I actually think vulnerability is that it is a strength, even though that sounds like a contradiction, because I feel like being able to admit when we're wrong or that we don't know something shows that we're all a work in progress, that we're all learning more to be better humans. And I think for children to see that in their parents is a really powerful lesson. It doesn't mean that we don't see them as strong. I mean, I think in a healthy family, kids admire and respect and love their parents even when they're not perfect. And so I think it's important to raise kids, especially when we look at, the rates of mental health crises in the United States in particular is of course what I'm focused on, because that's where I am. But the rates of mental health decline for young people are pretty significant. And I would argue that it really matters not so much how we are parenting, but that we have the relationship. Again, that we're connected to our children in a way that when they struggle or when they're scared or upset about something, they come to talk to us about it. And our response to them is, thank you for telling me, how can I help? Right. And that's going to look a little bit different in every family, and that's okay. What I worry about is when kids don't have an adult they can come to. And so when something happens, whether it's online or with a friend or something scary in their life, that they turn to the internet instead, and there might be some useful tips on there, but a child isn't going to be able to filter the fake from the real, from the scary, from the unhelpful. And so that's where I think the parenting part becomes really important. We have to teach them also about how to access information and, be the trusted adult that they can come to. And it may not be, oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's almost like opening the Pandora box because
Yes.
there is so many things that are unhealthy in terms of,
Yes.
all these porn websites and so on. So maybe the start would be to actually monitor what pages our children are opening.
That's the ideal. And I hear that all the time. And I understand why people want that. But the problem with, I call them parental controls, but it's so filters and software and all of that. The problem with those is if they worked, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't have articles and books and news stories talking about how problematic it is, because children are very savvy. It's always true that the children are more knowledgeable about the current tech than parents, which is true from when I was growing up. And, that's always been the case. It's also true that the internet has so much data and so much information in a new way that I call it digital whack a mole. There's a game, and I don't know if this is in Europe as well, but like there's a game where you like go to an arcade and you try to pop the little mole down into the hole, and it just keeps popping up. And so I see it as this is the problem. Whenever we try to like stop a website or stop an app, something else pops up in its place. And so it can be one tool to set limits and restrictions and try to filter, but it's not the only one. It has to be in conjunction with other things.
Fantastic. It comes to my immediate thought, the funny meme that I've seen, which was basically a little note from the parents saying that the password to network can be unloaded once the dishes have been cleaned.
Right.
Do you believe that kids should have some control like that? And because it's basically a reward base.
Yeah. You know, again, every family is going to do things a little bit differently. And I would say if that works for your family, great. The reason I hesitate a little bit is when we use screen time to reward, we make screen time even more appealing. It's the thing that children then want more than ever. And so I encourage parents to separate the chores from the screen time so that it's not if you do this, then you get that, which is a little bit. So the way I would phrase it is like, here are the expectations. As a member of our household, you are expected to do, these are the things we need. It's unload the dishwasher, it's clean your room. These are just as a member of living in this house. Then when those are done, then let's talk about what's coming next. And it doesn't have to be screen specific, because what happens then, if it's a screen, then that's all the kids want. And then they only do it to get the screen time. And the problem with that is we also have to remember we're teaching them life skills. We want children to know what it means to live with a roommate or eventually, do their own laundry. Those are skills they need to learn. And if they're only doing it because there's a reward, then it's an extrinsic motivation as opposed to something intrinsic. So I'm not saying you can't do it at all, but I'm just saying keep that in mind, as it may end up backfiring in the long run.
Perfect. We've got a question from Mary. She's asking, I have a very playful toddler who also loves to watch kids shows, and I feel like I am obliged to watch this episode tonight. There you go. I hope he's watching us. And if he's not watching, that's fine, because we're going to have lots of tips from Emily today.
Yeah.
So that's very powerful what you talk about. The reward-based approach to using internet. I remember Melinda Gates talked about the fact that they never sit at the dinner table with their phones on. They always have to leave the phones in another room, so there is no disruption. Would you say it's a useful approach?
Yes. I mean, yes, again, every family is going to have a different approach. What I recommend is that you identify a few zones or places or times where there are no phones for anyone in the family, because, and mealtime is great. Maybe it's a Sunday breakfast. Maybe it's every dinner. It depends, again, on your family and the schedule. What is important is that everyone in the family participates. So if it's a no phones at the mealtime rule, that means Dad can't bring his phone to the table. It's not just a rule for the children, right? And so one of the things that happens is if we make a rule, but it only applies to the children, then they're going to say, well, why do I follow that rule? If it's a family rule, but I'm the only one being asked to do it, that doesn't feel, they're not going to buy into that. It's not going to feel like it's a balanced thing. That doesn't mean kids have the right to do anything they want, right? Like parents have responsibilities and rights and privileges that are different. But I just encourage families, rather than a big rule like no phones at the meal table anytime, which some families might want to do, pick one. I mean, some families, it might be they don't do that ever. So let's start with one meal, that we all agree. And it's maybe even 15 minutes. One of the big things I tell parents is it's always things we can do, small changes to make big, longer term change. So baby steps is what I call it. Like, just a little bit at a time, and to think of it in the long term. So it's not just like I'm trying to do all of these big changes at once. It's little changes over time that are going to make longer term changes.
So, small steps that lead to big accomplishments, and that's how you develop a habit rather than uh, encroach it on your family. We
Yeah.
have a comment from Precious Williams. Hello, hello. Hey, Queens. She says, I hope you are going to watch us today, Precious. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Now, we've heard all about the horror stories of families with massive screen time contracts that fail. Why is
Yes.
the baby steps approach so crucial for creating sustainable change in a household's digital habits? You touched upon the baby steps, how they develop habits. Talk about a little bit more about what are the healthy habits that you've seen in your family or in your vicinity or with your
Yeah.
clients that developed a very good approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. A lot of those big screen time contracts don't work. And the example I always give is anytime you download a new app, it'll say I agree to the terms and conditions and we check a box. How many of us read the entire thing? Most people don't, right? And so the same is true for a child. What they want is the device or the app like we do when we get the new app. So they're going to sign anything. They're going to say, oh, yeah, 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 I agree to all of this. But a child, especially a young child, has a very different brain from an adult, and they cannot hold that long contract in their brain for a long time. So, what I tell parents is if you want to write down some screen time rules, they have to be small, specific, and fit on a post it note. That's the amount of rules you should have. And it can be broad, like you can say, we do not have phones at the dinner table, right? Like maybe that's the rule. Or our rule is all screens get plugged in the kitchen at night. That's it. We got to start real basic because the more rules we have, the harder they are to enforce and the less likely they are to stick. So I can give a couple. Would you like me to give a couple of
Yes,
examples?
do
Okay.
that.
So my favorite tip to give is something called living your life out loud. And this is something anyone can do at any time, whether you have children or not. It's a great strategy. So, what it means is as you are reaching for your phone or your device, you say out loud what you're doing. So, I'm reaching for my phone. I'm going to check what time soccer practice is. I'm looking at my work email. I'm going to see what time I have to be at my meeting. Just constantly narrating. Every time you open a new app, every time you tap something, you're talking out loud. Now, a few things about that. It's annoying, right, for everybody around. But what it does is it brings our awareness to how we're using it. And so, again, going back to that intentional part of what I like to talk about is I am showing you that I'm aware of how I'm using this as a tool. I always say to children, when they see the back of our phone, they have no idea what's happening on the front. And so we need to give them really concrete ways that we're using it as a tool. Then we can also start to expand on the emotional effects of it. I can say, I know we're standing in line and I'm bored and I've opened Instagram and now I'm looking at Instagram and I'm just scrolling and there's no end to this scroll and I still feel bored. Or I look at these pictures and they make me feel like my vacation's not as exciting as somebody else's vacation, right? So now we're starting to attach some emotional vocabulary to it to show how it makes us feel. All of this is both good for us and our accountability, but also showing our children and modeling the complexity of a device. What we know is that when we start living our life out loud, if our children start doing it or our spouse or our friends, it's working. Or even better, if your children roll their eyes like, oh, mom, it's working because they're hearing you. And we have to do it as often as we can, 80%. I always say 80% of the time. That's what we're striving for. Good enough parenting, right? It can have quite an impact. And that is like my favorite tip to give because you don't need anything special. You just have to start talking.
You'd have to start talking. And what about if it still continues and you still talk and there is no end to that
Right.
scrolling down the screen?
Right. Well, that's true. That could happen. So that's the first step, right? Is the awareness part, the accountability. And then what we need to do is have conversations with our family members. A lot of the work I do with private clients is looking at values, right? So what are the things in our family that are really important to us? You know, maybe we're really into hiking and being outside and nature. So what do we do as a family that supports that? And how does our screen use interfere with that? It might be also, how does our screen use, how can we use it to support our habit, right? Like maybe we use it to look up hikes, and that's a tool, right? We can model that for children. Here's how we're using it as a tool. But when we go out in the hike, we put them away. We want to be present in the moment. I mean, that's just an example. Every family will have a different one. Excuse me. So that's the first step, right? If you think, I think an interesting point you're making too is that oftentimes this is an adult problem, not a child problem. And I will say, screen time, the reason I work with parents is because I realize that screen time is not a kid problem, it's an adult problem that affects children. And that is where I go, okay, so we need to start with the adults, because when we work on our behavior and we talk about how we use screens, that's going to impact how our children do it.
You mentioned involving children in creating screen time rules. Can you share some practical tips on how to have this conversation with younger or
Yes.
older kids in an
Yes.
age-appropriate way?
Great question. I have quite a few ideas about this in my book. And one of my favorites is to say to, especially to young children, because if you say to a 6-year-old, what do you value? I mean, what 6-year-old knows what that is, right? That's too kind of obscure. But you can say, what would, if an alien from outer space landed in our living room and looked around, what would they notice? What would they say is important to our family? And it's fascinating to hear what kids say. And it's also okay. Sometimes kids will say, they'll see our TV, they'll see our Xbox, they'll see our phones. Okay, so what does that say about what we care about, what we value? So maybe it's, we value communication. What are all the ways that we communicate? So for parents, don't get stopped when the value comes back as a screen time value. Expand on that question. Keep getting curious about it. So one of the things I say all the time is replace judgment with curiosity. And that is because parenting is so judgy. Everybody's got an opinion about how you do things. And start by being curious about it, asking questions. I wonder, I notice, what would happen if? How does it make you feel when? So that it's not a fight with our children, right? It's more of a conversation of back and forth. And it's hard. It takes practice.
It's hard, it takes practice, but also you've got some people who may jeopardize your efforts. So to give you an example here, you have a bit of a perspective, Emily, because I was raising my child alone without my ex-husband, and quite often he would use my vulnerability,
Yes.
my weak moments to point out to my child that I am not capable of looking after the child. How do you deal with that problem?
Yeah, I get that question a lot when there's two different households and a child may go between. And you know, I'm not a mental health expert, so sometimes that tips more into that area. One of the things I just remind parents is we can only control what happens in our home, and that may be the case that like it could be an ex-spouse or parent or a friend, right? Child goes to a friend's house and they have very different rules. It might be no screens allowed. It might be it's a free for all. They can do as much as they want. So the best we can do is prepare our child for the world, to say, in our house, this is what we value. When you go somewhere else, it may be a different rule. And I know that, and I understand that, and I might not be able to control it. And that's hard for me, but that's why as a parent, our focus has to be on, I can only control my controllables. I can only do what's right in front of me. And that's hard, absolutely. That's not fair when that happens, but that's sometimes part of life too. And so helping our children be able to sort of understand that not always it's not always good intentions, and that's hard.
Yeah, so intentions are not there. Well, we have to deal with parents who have different approaches to screen time,
Yes,
and that could cause, for example, the child wants to leave your household. How do you deal with
that's
that?
right.
Because
That's right.
as fathers, they can have all the screen time in the world.
That's a really good question. And one thing we haven't talked about that I think is really, really important to understand is that screens, I mean, we say screen time, it means a lot of different things. I recognize that. But when we talk about how children consume it, it's games, video, streaming, social media, texting, YouTube. Those are kind of the big ones. When children are consuming those platforms, it's really important that we know they are designed intentionally to be addictive. So this is very different than a child sitting down with a really good book that they don't want to stop reading. If you've noticed, taking a book away from a child's a lot easier than taking an iPad away. And part of that is because of that design. It's called persuasive design or manipulative design. And what it does is there are elements, and tech companies are really smart. They've hired developmental psychologists to create tricks so that when children are on, they're encouraged to stay on longer. Now, adults are susceptible to this too, right? You know, like I said earlier, the bottomless feed on our Instagram or our Twitter or whatever app we're on, there's no end. That's on purpose. Or anytime you're watching a video and, you know, you used to have to click play next episode and now it auto plays. That's an intentional design change that keeps us on longer. That matters because the longer we're on, the more time we're watching something, the more opportunities we have to see an advertisement. And advertisements and ads is how companies make money, right? Is by getting money from ad companies. So it's very beneficial, excuse me, very beneficial to the tech companies, but it's extremely problematic for children because children's brains are not adult brains. They are far more susceptible to this. And so we are literally messing with their neural pathways. So it's like that dopamine feedback loop. It feels good. You want to keep playing. You just got a point in a game or you've got some reward and you don't want to stop. And if we stop them and interrupt that, we're interrupting that feel good dopamine. So that's one of the reasons that the reactions are so much stronger when it comes to screens and parenting. And so I really do think it's important for parents to understand that that's part of the challenge. So when it comes to going to someone else's house, we have to remember that is I always say you're not fighting your child, you are fighting a hijacked neural pathway. And so it's you versus the technology design, not you versus your child. And so, I mean, that involves a lot of conversations. I think it's valuable to teach children about this, to say, when you play that game, your brain really likes it. And I know it's really hard for you to turn it off. And it's because the game is made, it's designed to hold your attention. Kids will often respond with, that's not fair. They don't like being tricked. So I think there's power in educating them about what's going on. And then, of course, as parents, it's just challenging. We have to be adults. So, you know, again, in that two household situation, just saying, like, can we talk about some bare minimum shared values, even though we're different households? How can we do this for our child? And that's
Okay.
very hard. I understand that.
Absolutely, as you said, life sometimes is hard, sometimes it's not fair, and we have a couple of questions. So let's be fair to our audience and tackle these questions. Jane is talking about, I had a lot of friends who had a child that they just passed the parent responsibility to the phones.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I mean, I always say to parents, it may not be your fault that these things are addictive, but it is your responsibility to learn about it and do something differently. Now, I know in different countries there are probably different rules about this, but one thing in America that's happening is a lot of schools are bringing screen time into the classroom, like with laptops or iPads for students. And this was a big thing during the pandemic, especially, but it was a problem before. So I would add that there's a complicating factor here that kids are also now getting screens for schools, and it makes this much more complicated with their personal devices. That being said, it is absolutely still upon us as parents to know what our children are doing online. And it is very hard to take a device away once you've given it. And I've worked with families whose children have saved their own money and bought a device. So what do you do then? The kid paid for it with their own money. Who's in charge? I know the answer is that the parents are still in charge, but it becomes a lot more complicated. And then you have to factor in that it's built to be addictive. So it's not just taking something away that they like, it's taking something away that their brain is really hooked into, and it's going to make this a much more challenging situation. The other piece of this is, what's the parent screen time use like? Because more often than not, we as parents are very guilty of scrolling a lot and being on our phones around our kids. And if our kids are seeing that and we're telling them to get off, but we're not willing to change, that's not going to work either. So I hear this and I don't disagree, but I think it's a lot of complexity to this.
A lot of complexity. We have to come back to our topic we discussed with Rachel Coward. She talked about how video games can be beneficial to your mental health, and she said games and learning. We learn a lot of things from playing games, and it's not just playing the games that are intended to teach us things. Like when I was a kid, I played those math games where equations would show up on the screen and you would shoot them with your spaceship. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about games that we want to play. Games like Civilization teach us about world history. So
Yeah,
there are useful ways of involving kids in technology or in games or in, as you call it, a screen time. We
yes.
have another question from Olga Vasina. Fascinating discussion, ladies. Thank you, Beata. Emily, is there a sensible balance to screen time? Example, games, web, social media, computers, TV, at all.
Yes, right. And of course, all of those things are screen time, right? When we talk about screen time, we mean all of these things. This is a great question, and it's one I get all of the time. Um, the American Academy of Pediatrics sets some limits, and so does the World Health Organization, and they're similar in their limits. What's very interesting is that they don't actually specify time limits above age 6. And that's intentional because I think it's partly because it sets parents up for failure if we're giving too rigid of a boundary. That being said, I go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is later is better, less is more, right? So obviously, I always say a little bit's okay and a lot is too much, but it depends so much on the child. So what I know in the US is that children around 12 to 14 are spending about 5 hours a day on screens outside of school time. And teenagers, it's closer to 7 or 8 hours per day. That is on top of whatever screens are happening at school, which, as I mentioned earlier, is increasing. So to me, that sounds like too much, right? And to Beata, to your point about educational games, like Civilization, I think there are some really wonderful ways to use it. My concern is that when that becomes the only thing that's happening in a child's life, then we have displaced some of the normal and healthy parts of childhood. So if it's an exception, right? Like occasionally I'm going to play some video games, or occasionally we're going to watch movies together as a family, or sometimes it's just dumb TV and that's what we want to do. If it's the exception, not the rule, I don't see necessarily that there's a huge issue with that. I'm sure there are exceptions to that. So the questions I want parents to ask are these 2 questions. Do I know what my child is doing online? Not necessarily the quantity, but what they are doing. And back to our earlier point, do you have a good relationship with your child so that when something happens online, they will come and talk to you? Those are kind of the 2 questions that I think are more beneficial than a total amount of time. Because FaceTiming with grandma is very different than scrolling through TikTok videos, right? So an hour of each of those is a very different experience for a child. So I didn't give a satisfying answer, I know, but it really depends.
Well, let's try a satisfying answer for a question. How do you build a good relationship?
Oh, that's a good question. And it starts from day one, right? Like we have all of our children's lives to build good relationships. And I really don't want parents to feel like, I've got a teenager and it's failed and I'm doomed. No, we are always capable of change. We are always capable of making improvements that make our lives and our children's lives better. And so I think it's very valuable to, if we have to, as a parent, to own it, to say, wow, I didn't do a great job of this. I want to try again, right? So we disarm a little bit. One of my favorite parenting lines a parent educator taught me: I forgot to teach you. This is such a powerful sentiment and a way of talking to our kids that makes the conflict kind of melt. So if it's something like, oh my gosh, I forgot to teach you that when we go to a restaurant, it's rude to look at our phones when the waiter is asking for our order. I forgot to teach you that. Oh my gosh. So it takes it off the child as a behavior that's bad or we're mad about, puts it on us. It's our responsibility. So that can be just a really nice little simple hack, right? To just use that line when we're not sure what to say. The other thing is sometimes we have to, I say, go backward to go forward. Sometimes we actually might use the technology itself to connect with our kids first. And what I mean by that is, I don't know, like Minecraft, right? A lot of younger children are very into Minecraft. So it's something like sitting with your child while they're playing. I know parents don't love it, and it's not the worst game, honestly. I think there's some creative elements that are pretty cool, but to sit and say, tell me about what you're building. Show me what you made. Express interest in their interests. That is how you start to connect with your children. Even if you don't like it, it's okay to pretend in that situation, to say, tell me about that. I want to learn because I see it's important to you. Then we can transition away from that. So it might be like, okay, our time is up. Put your tools in the trunk. Tell me what you're thinking about doing next time when we go upstairs or to the living room. Let's draw a picture of what you want to do next time, or explain to me. So we can kind of use the technology as the transition as well. That's not going to work for every child, but I feel like it's a way of validating what they're interested in, and that's a way of building connection.
Well, that's a great phrase. I forgot to teach you that. It will go along with another great phrase from Karin Jakubowski, which starts, help me understand.
Oh, yes. Help me understand. I love that.
There
Yeah.
you go. And you talk about the neural pathways and how technology is abusing the neural pathways. We are a little bit manipulative here, aren't we?
Yeah, yeah, it is. And it's funny because I tell parents, I'm like, parenting is marketing. It's how you sell something to your kids, right? So we can kind of reframe this as like, hey, I've got this idea and we're going to try this new thing. We're just going to try putting phones away for the weekend and see what happens. It's a family experiment, right? Like, instead of saying no phones for the weekend, right? Like, very different reaction that you're going to get from your kids. So sometimes it's just like how we sell it to them.
That's a nice way to put it. Now we have another question, another talk from Mary. Her experience: English is not our first language, but my son speaks like Peppa. He sounds like a native English speaker, but can't speak with our own language. And responsible screen time really matters, she adds.
Yeah.
There you go. You can talk like Peppa the Pig. I hope it's not going oink oink. However, let's focus on some more questions we have now. Beyond limitations, are there specific apps or specific programs you would recommend to parents?
Short answer, no. Because, as I said, there are so many challenges to those as the solution. That being said, if a parent has controls that they like, or screen time setting limits or whatever within their devices that they use, that's fine. I don't want you to throw that out. What I get concerned about is, for example, a parent will say to me, oh, I check my child's social media accounts. I'm staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning looking through all their feeds just to check on it. That's not a good quality of life for the parent. And it's also not great because then it's like, what about the conversation part, right? Like, she's not having that conversation with her child. She's looking at her stuff, which I don't want to say is a violation of privacy. I mean, it is, but nothing is private on the internet. So I understand parents need to do that. I also don't endorse products because to me, using technology to solve a problem technology created is challenging. And if they worked, again, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, what I encourage parents to do is think about, again, later is better, less is more, relationships first. So, delaying access to smartphones as long as possible is great. So, maybe you were thinking age 10, wait till 12. That 2 years of brain development is so important for those children. You're only helping them. I have never had a parent say to me, I wish I gave my child a phone sooner. I wish I gave my kids social media access sooner. The other thing to keep in mind is that you might say no to social media and your child will get it anyway. And that may be because they have a phone. It might be because they're accessing it on a friend's phone or a school computer. So we can't just say no, right? It's not as simple as that. I wish it were. So it has to be a conversation about why. How does this fit into our values? What do we need to know? One thing I love to do, read the terms and conditions with your child. They are not easy to understand. They're written by lawyers in complicated language. It's long, it's boring. But hidden in there are things like, we actually won't protect your privacy, or things are never going to be private, or we might copy your images and use them for our own marketing purposes. Kids need to understand that. And I think parents often don't even know that themselves. So it's a valuable learning experience to do that together as part of a shared opportunity. If and when you decide you do want your child to have social media, or they ask for it and you're ready, make an account first as your child's age for you to use for a week first and see what happens. So I did this with Snapchat, pretended I was 15. Within 30 minutes, I got porn. And I didn't look for anything. It was just the algorithm fed it to me, saw that I was 15 and female. That was all the information I gave. So if you're not ready for that, your child definitely isn't ready to have that sort of unlimited access. And so we have to have those conversations, whether we want to or not. I mean, that's the reality.
Cyberbullying is a growing concern. How can parents empower their children to be safe and responsible online citizens?
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, adults are cyberbullies too, right? If you
Mm,
look at any comment thread on any post that's not even controversial, right? So certainly modeling how we talk is how our kids talk, how we type is how our kids are going to write comments. Um, Again, later is better, right? Again, giving children an opportunity for brain development to get more mature before we give them a device, always better. The other reality is we have to talk to them. Why is it easier for us to write something on a screen than to say it face to face? When I was a teacher, I would actually have my students do these exercises, like try saying some of this stuff out loud. Doesn't it feel a lot harder? Why is it that we can feel safe behind a screen, but we would never say those things out loud? And so one of the things that I worry about is that parents give their children phones in order to keep them safe. Right? I hear this a lot from parents, and I understand that. But in keeping our kids safe by giving them phones, we're giving them unlimited access to the internet, where safety is like kind of a mess. And cyberbullying is very, very real. And so I would say, from even before children have phones, talking about friendships and relationships and social skills, those are all really important childhood experiences that they need to have offline first to know how to deal with online. And one of the ways we can do that as parents is prioritize play as much as possible, offline play in the real world, unstructured, casually supervised. I'm not saying throw them into a risky situation, but give them opportunities for some risky play, because that's how kids build confidence. That's how they practice communication skills. That's how they learn empathy and critical thinking. Those are all skills that they are going to need to address cyberbullying. And we want them to come to us. So that has to be another thing we talk about all the time is when you see something online you don't understand, that's scary, mean, violent, pornographic, please come talk to me. I'll help you. We'll problem solve. I will never be mad at you, right? That is absolutely an important message we need to get across if our kid is anywhere near the internet. And that's a hard thing. Most parents are like, what? I don't want to talk about all that, but we have to.
Mm, we have to. Well, if it happened that you were short-tempered, how do you go back and
Yeah,
apologize?
great
And
question.
mm,
Yes, and I call that, I mean, it's not my word, but that's repair, right? When we want to fix something that we did wrong. Because that's a really important life skill too, is we make mistakes. We might say something that hurts someone's feelings and we may not have even meant to do it. That is all real world skill building practice that we can do offline first. And that happens in our families too, right? Where we can say, I think I said that or it hurt your feelings and I apologize. I own that. Or we can say when our feelings have been hurt. You know, if a child says to his mom, that really hurt my feelings, we can't get defensive. We can't say, well, I'm an adult and da 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 da. So, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know, right? That is hard for adults, right? But we have to do that because we want the kids to know you can go back and you can fix it. The problem with online stuff is it's there forever, you know, and even if you delete something, you know, there's screenshots and all kinds of like ways of storing things. And so unfortunately, normal mistakes that get made online can live forever. And that can be really hard. When you're a child, you're not thinking about what happens when I'm 28 and I'm applying for a job and a boss goes back to look at my social media posts from 20 years prior. But that's happening. And so it's that we have to help kids understand there are higher stakes to mistakes online. And that's not fair, but that's true.
mm. Looking ahead, Emily, what exciting trends do you see emerging in the era of digital wellness for families?
Yeah, you know, okay, a few things I'm optimistic about. In the US and the UK, especially, I'm seeing a lot of movement towards phone free schools, which to me is a no brainer. Why would you let children bring phones to schools? And not when I say children, I mean kids as young as 6 and 7 bringing smartphones and smartwatches to school. That is very much happening. There is no need for a phone in a school, and actually, it's a lot of parents who push back on this, but schools have offices with landlines. That's all you need. And children need that time during the day to be free from their parents. That's going to be an antidote to mental health problems later. Giving kids independence and freedom in childhood to learn some skills independent of their parent is absolutely important to future mental health. No question. Another positive trend I see is actually the flip phone is kind of coming back just a little bit, but like sales are up just a little. And, you know, these sort of phone alternatives that I see as more appealing now. I think people are kind of burned out. The internet isn't what it used to be. I have a lot of hope for the young. I know this is a very cliche thing to say, but for Gen Z and Alpha, like they're kind of like, what did you do to our childhoods? We grew up with these devices and I don't think we liked it. And so I think there is a movement towards a more intentional approach, which is what I believe and argue for. So those things give me hope. I'll stay on the positive. Those things give me hope.
Because we are joining Positivity Hugs Delivered, and let's talk about your book, The Screentime Solution. Can you share some key
Yes.
takeaways parents can take from the book?
Well, you've heard a few already, right? Which is living your life out loud. That's one of my big ones. Another thing we go into more in depth in the book is looking at our own experience as a child. How we were parented affects how we parent our children, and so that can be a very valuable conversation to have with your, you know, your co-parent, your, you know, any other relatives in the family, because people often have a different approach to parenting. That's okay. It's normal. It's an opportunity for conversation. Um, at the end of the book, I do talk a little bit about some of the problematic screen use, like what some of those, like when we step into what's really worrisome behavior around screen use. But each chapter ends with little summaries of like, these are the highlights. These are a few things you can try at home. So that was my goal, was rather than focus too heavily on all the bad stuff and the problem, was what can we actually do about this? Here's the solutions, right? Rather than the problem.
Well, speaking about books, what is the number one book you wish you read before you started your career?
Oh, I love this question. So I recently read Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of the American Mind. And he actually has a brand new book out called The Anxious Generation, which I highly recommend to parents as well. But The Coddling of the American Mind is a lot about what I was talking about with parenting and the problem with that overprotectiveness when children are young, depriving them of some of that experience as they get older. And so I feel like it's a book I could read at different points through my life and have a new viewing of it. So I encourage. It's a very good thinking book. So I love that one.
Stimulates your thinking, and definitely you recommend probably in paper version.
Exactly. Yep.
The, there you go. Now, can you tell us your life lesson quote and how did it change you?
Mm. So I love this. It's you can't control the wind, but you can direct your sails. And to me, that was a very powerful thought that like I wanted to be able to fix and control and make things perfect so that nothing bad would happen. And I realized that's never going to be possible. I cannot change how the wind blows, right? But I can adjust how I respond to the wind. I can change the direction of my sail. I can, shift my framework for how I see something. And that's been very powerful as a parent and as a educator and as a, consultant now is like helping people reframe it. So it just puts it in a positive, right? To positivity. It helps a lot. The reframing has been very valuable for me.
Well, it goes well with our other quotation, which is quotation that we like to use, and it talks about if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude.
Yeah.
Uh, that's Maya Angelou's quotation. And since we are talking about quotations, kids are like wet cement. Whatever falls on them makes an impression. Would you agree
Oh,
with that? Dr. Haim
yeah.
Guinot said that.
Yes. And they're also resilient. I think I understand the sentiment, trauma leaves a mark forever. And you can still shape cement, right? It's still wet, it's still malleable. But I understand that. I do, kids are impressionable and they're capable. I think that's a message I want parents to have confidence in your children's abilities, right? We believing in them means they believe in themselves. And that is again, those mental health fears later, they need those experiences in childhood. That's the preventative approach.
Speaking about the confidence, social media can be a major source of anxiety and comparison for teens.
Yeah.
What advice can you offer to parents?
Yeah. Again, less is more, later is better. So, there's always people who say, well, my kid has this group that they connect with online and they feel connected because they have, a group of friends that values and supports them. Yes. And social media is designed to be addictive, right? There's that, again, the bottomless feed, the likes, all of those things keep us on longer. So again, encouraging children to have real life relationships with peers and real world connection with friends to balance some of that out is really important. And not all children are the same. Not children are not standardized. So one child might be able to spend an hour in Instagram and not be that affected, and another child might have one negative comment and dive into an anxiety tailspin. And so the problem is, how much do we want to experiment on our kids, right? Like, I kind of want to give them an opportunity to get their brains fully developed before we go full social media.
Before we go full social media, before we develop their strength and ability to fight with the cyber world. Now,
Exactly.
since we are talking about ability to fight, I like to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, who talks about women are like tea bags. We never know their strength until we put them in hot water.
I love that.
So, Emily, how are you brewing? How are you in
How am
hot
I?
water?
I one of the things my values, I write them down. I have one of my values is courage. And what I love about courage is that it's not being not afraid, right? Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. And I find myself over and over again in situations where I might be afraid to speak up or speak out, but I do it anyway. And that um, gives me strength to keep going.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Emily, for that answer. We've got a great comment from Patrick. In Patrick's opinion, marvelous and instructive show once again. Beata, thank you, Emily Cherkin. Very insightful.
Thank you.
I I totally agree with that, and thank you so much to our commentators today: Mary Aileen Esmeralda, Precious Williams, Jane, Olga Vasina, and IPO Vit. Emily, it's been a pleasure to
Thank
join you today
you.
and have all these great advice. I hope our um, commentators and also whoever is watching the show can relate to these great tips. And if you still need some more tips, go and buy the Emily's book.
Yay. Thank
And
you.
that's it from episode 139 of PhD Livestream. Thanks to our guest Emily Cherkin. To stay updated and ensure you never miss a positivity hack delivered, follow Woman on it and turn on notifications to be alerted once a video has been released. Next week, we have guest Melissa Carson. We are going to talk about crafting your dream career, leading with confidence, and navigating life's next big leap. Thank you so much, everyone, for our today's questions, comments, and whoever participate in discussion. As always, our positivity quote comes from positive thinking only and goes look for something positive each day, even if some days you have to look a little bit harder. Today is your day to hug the future, hug the positivity you want, and build that confidence bone. Thank you.
Thank you.